Hi, good morning everyone. So welcome back from your reading break. So like what I've mentioned, to really make sure na we maximize the remaining time for in preparation for your Module 1 exam, instead of using our last session to discuss the exercises for Chapter 4, I will trust na you will go through this with me. So as an incentive and to just give you a chance also to really focus on your exam, ito yung mga changes na we'll be making. So number one, the problem set for chapter 4, rather than submitting it online, you can opt to submit it handwritten before the exam starts on Sunday. Therefore, ang deadline ng PS4 would be October 22. So this is the chance for the people that have missed assignments and then ito yung pambawi nyo in terms of points. So we're soon gonna be closing the first third of our SEM for 99.1. So please, for participation, alam nyo kung sino yung mga hindi pa nakasabit ng homework. Please take this as a chance to review, but also just to guide you when it comes to the chapter 4 exercises. So again, in terms of how to prepare for the exam, like what I've mentioned, ang crucial talaga dito would be chapter 3 and chapter 2 in terms of like the exercises, understanding everything. But of course, chapter 4 will tie everything together. So with that said, let's now proceed to the overview. So basically, chapter 4 is a very special chapter in the sense that finally, after just few weeks of understanding accounting, we can now finally complete the accounting cycle. And then from there, ang major goal lang talaga natin today is three things. To familiarize ourselves with the worksheet. So please take note of the weird things about the worksheet. Number 2, master the different journal entries. So adjusting, closing, correcting, and reversing entries. And then finally, number 3 is understanding our classified statement of financial position. So yun yung pinaka tututukan natin today, right? So number 1, we can take a deep dive in terms of our exercises breakdown in terms of completing the accounting cycle. And basically, these are the things that we need to do, right? So before anything else, let's go back to our accounting cycle. So step by step. So congratulations, right now, we're at the level 4 or the full accounting cycle process. And as you know, basically, it starts from analyzing the business transactions all the way to preparing our post-closing trial balance. So in terms of the accounting cycle, daily, what we'll be looking into would be analyzing the business transactions, journalizing, posting to ledgers. And then periodically in chapter 3, we learned na we can now then adjust our trial balance and create our financial statements. And then finally, annually, we do our post-closing entries, right? So now, the next step is we need to appreciate the classified balance sheet. So again, when it comes to accounting and also in life, knowledge is power. And therefore, in terms of the classified financial statements, basically the reason why we're doing this is that we're enhancing the usefulness significantly of our financial statements. And the goal is to classify accounts into significant groups. Why? Bakit importante? Because you need to know ano yung current assets mo, ano yung current liabilities mo, ano yung non-current assets mo, and non-current liabilities. Because for example, ang dami mo palang current liabilities, marami kang kailangan ng obligations na bayaran. And let's say, mataas yung assets mo. But if the bulk of your assets are non-current assets, matatakot ka. Because technically, your current assets should be able to pay for your current liabilities. So that's the reason why we have to break them down into 5 sections. Current assets, non-current assets, current liabilities, non-current liabilities, and equity. And basically, the idea is so that it helps you improve your comparability, right? So there, we now jump into first, assets. So this is an example of Jollibee Food Corporation and then their consolidated classified financial position. So ito yung first part. You have your assets and your non-current assets. So again, our current assets are basically those na you expect to be realized within 1 year of your business operating cycle. So please, i-memorize nyo na. Ano ba ang mga current assets natin? Cash, short-term investments, accounts receivable, mga prepaid rent that's within 1 year, inventories, supplies, all of those are current assets. Again, all of those are current assets. So again, ano ulit yun? Cash, receivables, inventory, supplies, any prepaid rent within the 1 year of the business operating cycle are all current assets. In contrast, non-current assets are those that are held beyond 1 year of the business operating cycle. So this is your property, plant and equipment, so mga equipments, land, intangible assets, long-term investments. Basta parang matagal yung investment, that's non-current asset because typically those lasts beyond 1 year of the business operating cycle. On the other hand, current liabilities are a bit trickier in the sense that there are different ways for a liability to be current. Either one, you expect them to be settled within the normal operating cycle. Number two, either they're held for the purpose of trading. Three, it's due to be settled within 12 months after the end of the reporting period. Or four, the business has no right to defer settlement for at least 12 months. On the other hand, non-current liabilities are basically those that are paid after 1 year or after an operating cycle. So simply, kapag accounts payable siya, that's most likely a current liability. Yung notes payable, a portion of that na kailangan mong bayaran for within the next year would fall under current liability. But the rest will be non-current, right? And then finally, you have equity. So now for equity, super dali lang tayo right now because a lot or basically all of our exercises fall under sole proprietorship, right? So sila Puddy, sila Ray Rose, all of those are just basically sole prop. So mga owner capitals lang sila. Pag partnership and corporation, so in this case, si Jollibee Food Corporation, you can see that their equity is kind of weird, right? May capital, may stocks, may reserves, may retained earnings. All of those you'll discuss in chapter in 99.2, right? So right now, lucky tayo, equity is just basically owner's capital, right? And then finally, the last would be notes. So basically, it's equally important as because they provide additional information. So for example, yung inventory mo, may breakdown ka. So ito yung assets mo, right? This is an example of a notes for the inventory. Like, bakit naging 8,295,000? Because ito yung nangyari. May net realizable value, may cost. So these just provide additional information, right? So ang importante, net, and what I need you to be experts in preparation for your exam is, please, wag na kayo maghula. Kailangan super master niyo na ano ang current assets and ano ang non-current assets, anong current liabilities, anong non-current liabilities. So dito papasok si E15, right? So exercise 15. So the idea lang is, given all of these, saan sila papasok? So first, accounts payable. That would be a current liability because typically accounts payable are expected that you have to pay within the operating cycle or within 1 year. Next, accounts receivable are current assets. Again, you're expecting to collect them within the operating cycle. Cash is obviously current assets. Owner's capital are basically owner's equity. Patents. So now, patents are a bit tricky. Hindi pa natin ito pinag-aaralan. But again, kung hindi natin pinag-aaralan, it's probably something to do with an non-current asset. It's an intangible asset. So intangible meaning hindi mo mahahawakan. Unlike land, unlike equipment na pwede mong ituro, that's a car, that's a land, that's a building. Patents are basically to secure your rights, right? So pag intangible assets like franchise, copyright, patents, all of those would fall under non-current assets. Next, salaries and wages payable. Well, of course, if you've been interning or parang may kakalala kayo nagtatrabaho, syempre, they want to be paid within a year, right? Or ASAP. So salaries and wages payable should be current liability. Next, inventory. Again, expected mo dapat mabenta siya within the operating cycle. So, current asset. Share investments to be sold in 7 months. what is this, right? So this is an example of a current asset because it's a short-term investment. Plano mong ibenta siya to get cash within 7 months. That's within 1 year, right? So that would be current assets. Bond investments to be held for more than 2 years. So again, it's an investment. That's an asset. So since it's held for 2 years, it's gonna be a non-current asset. Accumulated depreciation, we already know that falls under equipment. Building is property. Land is property. Notes payable due in 2 years, non-current. Supplies, again, supplies are current assets. Equipment, and then finally, prepaid expenses, most likely 1 year lang naman yan. That would be your current assets. So that would be the answer to your 15. So the idea here is, kailangan yung assets mo, pareho pa rin. So experts na dapat kayo sa paggawa ng balance sheet. Assets should be ordered in terms of liquidity. Liabilities naman in terms of how soon they're gonna be paid, and then owner's equity will be owner's equity, right? So we're done with exercise 15. The next step is, let's make a classified balance sheet, right? So we have Sensei Golf Range at December 31, and then you have your trial balance. So in the same way, basically, merong mga notes. Assume that the 30,000 yen of the notes payable will be paid in 2023, so next year, and then the rest will be paid 2025 onwards, right? So importante to tingnan. So let's start. Ano yung format? Please. So ano yung format ulit? First header, name of the company, Sensei Golf Range. Next would be classified statement of financial position, and then again, ano difference ng income statement and statement of changes in owner's equity? They talk about a period. Compared to a balance sheet, they talk about a point in time. So dapat it's as of December 31, 2022. Ano yung 5 components natin? Initially, it was just assets, and then we further break it down to current asset and non-current asset. Then next would be identifying ano ba yung total assets mo. The other hand, you have your liabilities and owner's equity, which is separated by current liab, non-current liab, and then finally, you have your owner's equity. So you have, kailangan mag-balance yung assets mo sa totals and liabilities. So ano yung current asset natin? First is the cash at 18,040 because it's in order of liquidity. Next is AR of 14,520. And then finally, our prepaid insurance, which are prepaid expenses, na 4,680. The next step that we're gonna be doing is adding this. So if you add the 3 of these, that would be 20,120. So now, we move to our non-current assets. So ano yung first? You have your equipment at 62,400. Next would be your accumulated depreciation. So nakikita nyo, the accumulated depreciation is specifically for equipment at 18,720. So that should give you an equipment of 43,680. Next is your building. Building, you have what? 128,800 less the accumulated depreciation of 42,600. So the carrying amount of your building is 86,200. And then finally, you'll have your land at 65,000 in terms of So the question is, bakit wala accumulated depreciation ng land? Something to note about is that land is a very special asset. And the reason why is because it doesn't depreciate. So if you add the carrying amount of the equipment of 43,680 plus your building carrying amount of 86,200 plus 65,000, it will give you a total non-current asset of 194,880. And then by adding those, the 194,000 plus the 20,000 total current assets, your total assets would be 232,120. So dito pa lang, alam na natin na that the total liabilities and owner's equity should be equal to 23,120. But paano natin kukunin yon? First, we start with our current liabilities. You have your accounts payable at 12,300. Ano pa yung mga payables dito? You have your interest payable of 3,800. You have your notes payable of 30,000. Saan nanggaling yung 30,000? Yung 30,000 nanggaling dito sa statement that assume that 30,000 of the notes payable will be paid in 2023. So out of the 97,000, 30,000 are current liable. And therefore, if you add the 3, you'll have your 46,100 total current liabilities. Yung notes payable mo, therefore, is not 97,780. It's 97,780 minus 30,000. So the rest that will be paid in 2025 onwards would be 67,780. So your total non-current is 67,780. And finally, your owner's equity will be 118,240. So now, you'll have 118,240 plus 113,880. You'll have 232,120. So again, this should be S Sensei capital, right? So with that, we're done with Sensei Golf Range. And we already know how to classify our statement of financial position. So it's the same pa rin na assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. Just this case, kailangan lang natin na may current assets, non-current assets, current liabilities, non-current liabilities. Next. The next thing that I want you to master is not really how to write a worksheet. It's more of how to analyze the worksheet, right? So ano nga ulit yung worksheet? Unlike your trial balance, the worksheet is a more comprehensive way of summarizing everything. So worksheets are optional. Again, worksheets are optional. It's just so that you can provide financial information at an earlier date. Na pag ginawa mo na rin naman siya, dahil sobrang hassle niya, might as well, this should serve as the basis for your financial statements. The only thing that I want you to take note more than how to do the worksheet would be how weird it is, right? So basically, ano yung two weird things about the worksheet? Number one would be sa income statement. So usually, ang makikita nyo is that yung income statement mo will not initially balance. Your debits are 9,894, which are comprised of your various expenses. And then you have your revenue of 12,800. So now you have a missing debit. So this missing debit sa income statement, is this a signal of a net income or a net loss? Since it's a debit, the initial thinking is, baka net loss kasi bakit debit siya sa income statement? It's probably an expense, so parang net loss. But in reality, ang titingnan nyo kung net income ba siya or net loss is here in your credit side. Wherein yung debit siya sa income statement, pero naging credit siya sa financial position para mag-balance lahat. Since credit siya sa financial position, this 2,906 is a net income. So it's kind of hard to understand, pero makes sense, right? 2,906 on your financial statement is a credit. And a credit increases your owner's capital. So ang titingnan nyo kung net loss or net income is saan ba yung position nito sa statement of financial position. So to memorize, dun sa mga mahilig mag-memorize, sa worksheet, yung net income mo will come out as a credit in your statement of financial position and then as a debit in your income statement. Kapag net loss, baliktad. It will come up as a debit in your statement of financial position and then it will come up as a credit in your income statement. So please, yun lang yung weird sa worksheet. So intindihin nyo ulit yun. Again, if it's a net income, it will come out as a credit in your statement of financial position, but as a debit in your income statement. So now, aside from the worksheet, the last thing that we have to know is how to close the books, right? And ito, if there's one thing you'll have to memorize for chapter 4, ano yung temporary and your permanent accounts. So your temporary accounts relate only to one given accounting period. So we have to zero out our revenues, we have to zero out our expenses, and we have to zero out our owner's drawings because we zero out our temporary accounts. On the other hand, we don't close our assets, our liabilities, and our owner's capital because they are permanent or real accounts. So they relate to 2 or more future accounting periods. And like what I've mentioned, closing is very mechanical. You have a closing entry to zero out your revenue. You have another entry to zero out your expenses. And then pagbabanggain mo. Income summary and income summary. Sinong mas malaki? The income summary na credit 12,800 and is higher than your debit of 9,894. So to zero out income summary, we'll need another debit of 2,906, which is then ipangbabangga mo to your owner's capital. So we technically close our income summary to our owner's capital. And then finally, our drawings will always be a debit to our owner's capital. So now, the last thing is, now that we've closed, yung post-closing trial balance mo, what that would mean is that it only contains permanent accounts. Wala ng temporary accounts because drawings, revenues, and expenses are zeroed out already by the time may post-closing trial balance, right? So now, let's test our mastery. So first step is worksheet and journalizing. So binigyan kayo nito, right? Si Bada Co, si Bada Capital. So first step is basically to use your adjusted trial balance. And then, we will then transfer them to your income statement and financial position. So step 1, create your income statement. So ano yung titingnan natin? Itong portion lang na to. The ones that relate to your income and your expenses. So you have your revenue, you copy that lang. And then, i-add 12,307, 15,590. May kulang sa debit. So, kailangan debit of 3,283 para mag-balance to 15,590. This debit will tell you na may credit ka sa financial position. And from here, alam mo na that it's a net income. So, 15,590. So, dito pa lang na debit na income statement, magiging credit yun sa financial position. Alam mo na it's gonna be a credit. So, Bada income statement for the month ending October 31. So, your income will be revenue and expense. So, revenue, service revenue, 15,590. Wages and expense of 10,840. So, in order of magnitude, 760, 650, 57, rent, depreciation, and insurance. Gives you 12,307 expenses. Gives you a net income of 3,283. On the other hand, in terms of your changes in owner's equity, you have 10,740. You'll have a debit of 46,820 and then a credit of 43,537. So dito pa lang, you already know that it's a credit. So credit of 3,283. So you'll have your 46,820. So itong 3,283 and then itong capital, Bada capital and Bada drawings will help you create your changes in owner's equity. So beginning balance, Bada capital, 27,960. You add any investments, parang wala naman. So ang only add is net income of 3,283. And then you have 31,243. And then less the drawings of 3,650 will give you your Bada capital ending of 37,593, right? And with that, you can now just create your balance sheet na classified. So you have your current assets, your non-current assets, your liabilities and owner's equity, your current liabilities, your non-current liabilities, and then your owner's equity. So for current assets, that would be cash, AR, prepaid rent, with a total of 20,120. You have your non-current assets of your equipment less app debt, giving you carrying amount for the equipment of 18,150, which is basically your non-current assets. So your total assets is 38,270. So dito pa lang alam nyo na that the total here should be 38,270. So yung mga current liabilities, accounts payable of 4,920, interest payable of 57, total current liabilities is 4,977. Note current liabilities, non-current liabilities is your notes payable at 5,700. And therefore, our owner's equity na kinumpit na natin, 27,593. So basically, if you add those two together, the total liabilities of 10,677 and the total equity of 27,000, you'll get 38,207. So basically, ito lahat ng and then sorry, so this should be owner's capital of 27,500. So now you have basically the idea behind your income statement and your changes in owner's equity. Again, the next step is we close the books, right? So basically you have 15,590, right? And then we close the expense accounts of 12,307. So kinos natin yung 15,590. Kinlose natin yung 12,307 of income summary for expenses. So salaries, rent, depreciation, interest expense. Then we close our income summary. So our income summary is 3,283. So since net income siya, that would be a debit of income summary of 3,283. And then finally, you'll have your owner's drawings na 3,650. So debit bada capital, credit bada drawings of 3,650. So again, pag net income, it's probably debit income summary to close it, right? Pag net loss, it's gonna be a credit income summary, right? Or in a nutshell, kailangan mo lang mag-zero out. So mas malaki si credit kaysa kay debit. So this will probably be a debit, right? Of 3,253. So basically, what we did lang was zero out our revenues and zero out our expenses so that it would be in the income summary. Our income summary, we close to our owner's capital, and then our owner's drawings, we close to owner's capital. So lahat ng expenses, lahat ng revenues, lahat ng drawings are all zeroed out and will all be transferred to our owner's capital. So if you look at it, ito yung basically kay Bada ko, yung revenues, zero out natin. So currently it's a credit, so we made a debit of service revenue and a credit of income summary. So nilipat natin si 15,590 dito. So that mazi-zero out natin si revenues. Next, si expenses, lahat sila debit. So we need to credit salaries, wages and expense, credit rent expense, credit depreciation expense, all the way until if you add them, that would be a corresponding debit to our income summary of 12,307. So closing entry 1, close out your revenue. Closing entry number 2, close out your expenses. Zero it out. Closing entry number 3, kailangan mo munang malaman, ano ba yung current balance na income summary? Right now, it's a credit of 3,283. And therefore, in order to close this account, we need a debit of 3,283. And therefore, credit siya of Bada Capital. So it will increase our Bada Capital. Makes sense. Your net income increases your owner's capital. Kaya, 3,283 credit. Kaya debit yung income summary, may credit si owner's capital. And then your owner's drawings, we zero it out. So currently, it's a debit. So we need a credit sa owner's drawings. And then, we need a debit for Bada Capital. So it makes sense. A debit for your owner's capital means it decreased and your owner's drawings also decreases your capital, right? So all in all, kapag pinlug in yun lahat with the beginning statement, it will give you your ending capital for your owner's capital. So now, basically, all we have to do is to create our post-closing trial balance. So now, it's cash, AR, lahat na yan, pero wala ka ng revenues, expenses, and owner's drawings, right? So wala na yung drawings, wala na si revenue. All of them are zeroed out, right? So permanent accounts na lang yung natira. So again, that is your closing example. So through this, we were able to do it. So now, the last thing that we need to do for chapter 4 is to summarize the 4 different journal entries. Number 1 is adjusting entries. So adjusting entries are in chapter 3. These are for your deferrals and your accruals. They are required. They are required. Closing entries, on the other hand, are those na pinag-usapan lang natin, the 4 journal entries. Again, those are required. Reversing entries, on the other hand, are optional, and correcting entries are also required as they come. So, again, reversing entries are optional, and they don't apply to all adjusting entries. Hindi lahat ng adjusting entries nire-reverse natin. Ang nire-reverse lang natin are what? Accruals. Again, ang nire-reverse lang natin optionally are accruals. And they're usually made on the first day of an accounting period. So bakit siya reversing entry? Because literally, you reverse. Kapag yung adjusting entry mo is a debit asset, credit revenue, your reversing would be debit revenue, credit asset. If you're sa accrued expenses, your adjusting entry is debit expense, credit liability. Then dito, babaliktarin mo lang. Debit liability, credit expense. So, alam na natin na ang only difference niya, so same ka with your normal, same ka with your adjusting, same ka with your closing entry, the only difference would be here sa reversing entry na to, wherein ni-reverse mo lang si wages, expense, and payable, binaliktad mo lang siya, so that you will have a simpler normal entry of 1,840. Versus here, na pag hindi ka gumamit ng reversing entry, mas magiging compound journal entry. So let's prove na it's optional, right? So now let's go to Stains Agency in terms of their journal entries. So first is prepare the closing entries for the temporary accounts shown above. So meron tayong mga accounts, right? So we have service revenue of 92,500. So basically, we zero it out. So currently it's a credit. So to zero it out, we need a debit. Service revenue, credit income summary of 92,500. Next, we have an interest expense of 7,700. So expense is currently a debit. So to zero it out, you need a credit interest expense and a debit income summary of 7,700. Then we look. So you have a 92,500 credit for income summary, and then you also have a debit of 7,700. So currently, meron kang credit of income summary. So therefore, to zero it out, you need a debit income summary, credit Arcurisu capital of 84,800. So with that, the next step would be to close our income summary already to our owner's capital. So again, ano yung closing entries? Closing entries are zero out your revenue, zero out your expense, number 2, and then number 3, close out your income summary to your owner's capital. Since credit siya na owner's capital, it makes sense na it's a net income. Right? So no more income summary, everything goes to the capital. So another way or another option for closing entries is just straight na wala ng income summary. I-straight mo na lang sa capital. And then, mag-net effect rin naman siya na 84,800. But these are just alternative method, right? So again, ang alternative method is, yung tinuro ko sa inyong 4 steps is the primary method, that's the income statement method. And then the alternative method is the balance sheet method. But for me, better na lang to focus on our primary method, right? So our Curiso capital is still 84,800. So wala namang kaso. Next is, we are asked to prepare the reversing entries on January 1. So what were the adjusting entries made? That's the first question. Ano nga ba yung mga adjusting entries? We had our accounts receivable, service revenue of 5,000, and we have our interest expense of 2,200, and a payable of 2,200. So how do we reverse this? Basically, literally, you reverse. So debit siya ngayon, so credit siya dapat sa reversing entry. Debit, credit yung service revenue, debit service revenue. So since na-reverse natin siya, that is debit service revenue, credit accounts receivable of 5,000. Next, yung interest expense, paano mo i-reverse? So kung debit siya na expense, credit siya dapat. And then yung payable, kailangan debit. So ang reversing entry lang natin is debit interest payable, credit interest expense of 2,200. So post the entries A and B and underline the balance of the accounts. So may closing entries tayo and then may reversing entries tayo. So we basically look at ano yung mga T accounts affected. So we have our receivables, our service revenue, our interest payable, and our insurance expense when it comes to their balance right now before closing. And then when we close it, makikita nyo na ano yung itsura. Ang makikita nyo is that the interest payable was zeroed out because of the reversing entry. The receivables went back to 19,500. And then yung service revenue nyo is weird. It has a debit balance of 5,000. And then yung insurance expense na normally debit, it has a credit of 2,200. So medyo weird siya, right? So medyo weird, si service revenue, that technically ang normal account niya is credit, pero now it has a debit balance. And then si insurance expense, na normally debit naman, has a credit balance of 2,200. So basically, kailan lang yan magpe-pay off? Pag nagbayad ka na. So nag-collect ka ng January 10, and nag-pay ka. So now, you will do an initial entry lang of debit cash service revenue. And then ito, debit interest expense, credit cash of 3,000. So ano yung T accounts niya? Yung 5,500, 5,000, magki-credit ka dito. And then ito, magde-debit ka. So in the end, lalabas that the revenue you earned for the next period is still zero. Pero dito, yung insurance expense, may 800 na expense. So what this is telling you is that 2,200 was your expense last period, and then yung 800 is for this period. So tingnan natin doon sa no reversing. Pag walang reversing, ang balance lang naman yan is that 0 si service revenue and 0 si insurance expense. Kapag nag-prepare ka ng journal entries of nag-collect ka ng 5,000, it would be debit cash, credit AR of 5,000. And then ito, meron kang compound journal entry na debit interest expense, debit interest payable, credit cash. So ang magiging itsura niyan is that in terms of your insurance expense, 800 pa rin for this period. And as you can see, pareho lang yung effect with reversing or without reversing. Ang nagkaiba lang is yung journal entries mo. For with reversing, it's the typical debit cash credit service revenue. Pero ito, rather than service revenue, binawasan mo yung AR mo. And then mas apparent siya dun sa interest. Na dito, dahil nag-reverse ka, mas maganda yung journal entry mo here. Isang simple interest expense, credit cash. Pero dahil hindi ka nag-reverse, ang maging itsura niyan is a compound journal entry of debit interest expense, debit interest payable, credit cash of 3,000. So as you can see, ito yung summary. Ito yung T accounts with reversing. Ito yung T accounts without reversing. And ano yung makikita nyo? With reversing, pareho pa rin na 800 yung debit sa insurance expense pero 0 yung service revenue for that particular period. And without reversing, 800 pa rin siya. The reason why that happened was because of that weird balance ng service revenue na debit 5,000 due to the reversing entry and the weird credit balance of your insurance expense due to the closing. Pero net-net, basically ang sinasabi lang ng slide na to is wala ang difference mag-reverse ka man o hindi. Pinapadali lang niya yung buhay mo sa initial recording for the next period. Yun. So we're now done with exercise 419, right? In terms of our 4 journal entries. So now is a good time to finally go to our last type or our correcting entries. So correcting entries are avoidable entries. So kailangan mo ba ng correcting entries? Honestly, in a perfect world, hindi. These are avoidable. But, of course, you are required to create correcting entries whenever an error is discovered because it affects a combination of accounts depending on the error. So let's correct entries. So ito raw yung trial balance and then may mga errors raw na nakita. So cash received from a customer on account was recorded as 550 instead of 590. Again, ang gagawin lang natin is to develop our framework. What is, what should be, and what is the correcting entry. So what is? Ano yung error niya? Ni-record raw niya na debit cash, credit accounts receivable yung 950. Pero ang mali niya is the number. Hindi dapat 950. What it should be is debit cash, credit accounts receivable 5,990. So now, what should we do? We should lessen. So nasobrahan yung pag-get niya ng cash. And nasobrahan yung pagbawas niya ng accounts receivable. So ang kailangan is, ano ba difference? Our cash is overstated. Our receivables are overstated. It's currently at 950 pero dapat 590 lang yung cash. It's currently 950 sa AR pero 590. So anong kailangan natin? Kailangan natin pababaan si accounts receivable at 360 and bababain si cash ng 360. So debit, accounts receivable, credit cash of 360. So number 2, ano ba yung nangyari? Nag-debit raw siya ng miscellaneous expense instead of an advertising expense. So ano yung what is niya? He debited miscellaneous expense of 75 and then credited cash for 75. When instead, dapat ang ginawa niya talaga is debit advertising expense, credit cash of 75. And therefore, ang adjustment should be what? Yung miscellaneous expense mo is overstated and your advertising expense is understated. And therefore, we need to debit advertising expense, so kailangan natin siya pataasin, and credit miscellaneous expense of 75, right? Ito, 3. The first salary payment this month was for 1,900, which included 700 of salaries and wages payable on March 30. The payment was recorded as a debit to salaries, wages, expense and a credit to cash 1,900. So ito lang ginawa niya. Debit, salaries, wages, expense, credit, cash of 1,900. So considering na no reversing entries were made, alam natin na this was wrong. Ang dapat is debit, salaries, wages, expense 1,200. Debit, salaries, wages payable of 700 to represent na yun yung utang niya for March and not for the April. And then credit cash of 1,900. So now, ang difference lang is yung 700. Wherein our salaries, wages, and expense is overstated. It shouldn't be 1,900. It should be 1,200. And the payable is overstated kasi hindi natin siya nabawasan. So kailangan bawasan natin siya ng 700. Therefore, ang kailangan natin gawin, therefore, as our correcting entry is pababain si salaries, wages payable by debiting it of 700 and pababain si salaries, wages, expense of 700 by debiting. I crediting, right? So number 4, you have the purchase on account of costing 310 was recorded as a debit to supplies and a credit to accounts payable for 310. So ano ulit yung ginawa niya? Nag-debit siya sa supplies, credit accounts payable of 310. Pero, what should it be? It should be what? Debit equipment of 310, credit accounts payable of 310. So, dapat rather than recording it as a supplies, it should be an equipment. So, pagpapalitin lang natin to. What should it be? Your supplies is overstated and your equipment is understated. So, now, to record the equipment, you have to increase your equipment by debiting 310. And then you have to decrease your supplies, that's overstated, by 310 through crediting supplies 310. So our correcting entry here is debit supplies 310, debit equipment 310, credit supplies of 310. Number 5, a cash payment of repair expense was recorded as what? Debit equipment, credit cash for 69. Pero, what should it be? That it should be a miscellaneous expense, debit 96 and credit cash. So, dalawang mistakes here. Yung number and also kung ano yung categorization niya. So, what should we do? Number 1 is that identify natin na si equipment overstated siya because pinataas mo siya for no reason. Number 2, the cash is overstated. Why? Because ang binawas mo lang sa kanya is 69. When in fact, ang kailangan mong ibawas sa kanya is 96. So, kinulang ka ng pagbawas. And therefore, overstated si cash. And then finally, yung miscellaneous expense, understated kasi hindi mo siya ni-record. Therefore, ang kailangan mo lang gawin is pataasin si understated miscellaneous expense by debiting the proper miscellaneous expense, 96. Pababain si equipment and cash by crediting equipment of 69 and crediting cash of 27. So in summary, these are your 5 correcting entries, right? So now, basically, ipa-plug in mo lang siya in terms of like, ano ba siya, debit or credit. And then from here, we can now adjust our trial balance and correct it. So accounts receivable is plus 360, so yung cash rin. So yun yung na-affect. And then you had advertising expense. So you have your accounts receivable and yung cash. So si cash, una pinababa natin ng 360. Si accounts receivable, dinagdagan natin ng 350, ng 360, kaya naging 3,560. Si advertising expense, from 600, we added 75. Si miscellaneous expense, from 290, dahil credit, binawasan natin ng 75. Naging 215. Salaries, wages, and payable, which is here, it's currently at 700. But since may debit tayo, we have to zero it out. So 700 debit cancels out the 700 credit. Your salaries, wages, and expense, kailangan rin bawasan ng 700. So 3,300 debit minus the 700 credit is a debit of 2,600. Your equipment will add. So from 10,800, ginawa natin 300 plus 310. So 11,110. Your supplies, kailangan natin bawasan kasi credit. So yung supplies of 800 debit, so minus 310 will give you a debit of 490. And then yung miscellaneous expense mo, plus 96. So miscellaneous expense. So yung 215 plus 96, 311. Your equipment of 11,110, kailangan natin bawasan ng 69. So 11,041. And then our cash would be subtract. So yung debit of 3,740, naging plus 27. So 307.13. So now we're done with BTS cable. So now we're basically done with problem set 4 and officially finished with chapter 4. So again, just to remind you, thank you so much for taking the time. As a bonus for all of your efforts and also for understanding, please submit a handwritten portion. It doesn't have to be complete. Kung gusto niyo ng partial points, you can just copy the answers and go through the exercises and submit me a handwritten. But for those that have missed on homework, I need you to submit a complete requirement for problem set 4 para ma-offset yung hindi nyo na-submit. Yun. So thank you so much, and I hope na you also watch our midterm reviewers to really help you for your exam on something. Right? Thank you and have a great day.